Marxists are scientists, and we got to always be studying world movements, new developments, what the class struggle on the other side of the world is teaching here, and they're also looking to what demands we make here. I want to talk about a virus, and it's new, and what's unknown is how contagious it is. It's a variation of the common cold. Wouldn't seem like a big deal. It attacks the respiratory system, leads to high fevers. But what's the mortality rate? This is a very new thing, really just a little bit more than a month old. And yet this virus kind of confirms how everything, even a virus, not that the virus knows it, but everything on this planet today is political and is all part of the class struggle. And it is a global class struggle. And so that's what we want to really pull out, because this is a virus that started in China. Now, is China responsible for a virus? Let's talk about what some viruses have done.
The common flu causes up to 5 million cases of severe illness worldwide and kills up to 605,000 people, 50,000 people every year, according to the World Health Organization.
It sometimes helps to just put numbers in perspective, even though we don't know where this, and China has every right to be concerned, right? But 650,000 people every year die just from the common flu.
In 1918, the Spanish flu virus caused between 40 to 50 million deaths. Between 2014 and 16, the Ebola virus started in West Africa, caused 11,325 deaths. From 2009 to 2010, the swine flu, or the H1N1 virus, started in the US, caused 284,500 deaths globally. 2017 through 18 flu, the H3N2 virus, caused 80,000 deaths in the United States. And 2020 coronavirus started in Wuhan, China, caused 500 deaths there in China.
A lot more may be on the way, but this is what China's worried about. They're worried about some of the past pandemics. They're worried about how quickly things can escalate. They're worried about numbers like the swine flu, which started in the US, and nothing was done. Nothing was done. They didn't even gather the figures for another couple of years, and it swept around the globe. Or the flu just the year before, 2017, 2018, 80,000 deaths in the US alone. And then there's all the global figures that they haven't finished gathering yet. So, do they have a right to be concerned? Of course.
2 days later, the Chinese Center for Disease Control had sequenced the entire genome of the virus, a rapidly achieved feat that it will help scientists around the world more fully understand it.
For comparison, during the 2014 outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, it took scientists 2 months to completely sequence that virus's genome.
Data from Chinese scientists have been published in international medical journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet, as well as in domestic journals China Science Life Sciences.
China's response to the outbreak has been swift and massive in cooperation with WHO's and the international scientific community. It is taking the outbreak very seriously.
Party committees and governments at all levels must take novel coronavirus outbreak prevention and control as the top priority of their work, said President Xi Jinping at a January 25th meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. which set up a high-level task force to combat the virus. Led by Premier Li Keqiang, the task force arrived in Wuhan on January 26th to coordinate efforts to contain the outbreak. As of January 27th, the Ministry of Finance has allocated $8.74 billion to combat the virus.
Now, that's an important summary that Josh, in both describing what the virus is in a very rational way, not in a scary way, and also what measures China was taking. But it gets back to, you know, there are like two stories going on in the world, right? And that's what we want to talk about next. When I say this is really part of the class struggle today, how to even see or understand this virus, how to handle a disease, what is the responsibility of the government, and how people can be mobilized or not.
Two different news sources, two different kinds of news stories. CNN, Fox, Google News, New York Times, Washington Post, and NBC News.
It's the U.S., right?
Chinese news sources in English. Global Times, People's Daily, Xinhua Net, and CCTV English YouTube.
Now, I raise this because sometimes, you know, we get asked, where do you get your information? Like there's some secret font. But it's actually very available. It's just coming from China itself and not coming through the filter of the U.S. corporate news, which has totally flipped this story. And that's really the important message here. But it's also so that everyone here has, if they want to do your own online checking, what are some real sources of news from China? And it's interesting to follow what's in the Global Times, or if you're checking out on YouTube, CCTV, they have constant hundreds of small news articles, 1 and 2 minute pieces that are describing a great deal. So let's talk about what the media focus on China is. Before I put this up, maybe some folks want to describe a little bit what you've seen here. What you've seen in the U.S. media.
Wanted me to talk about basically what is my impression from what I've seen in the media, right? Okay, what rings true to me is they talk about a lot of deaths. And I think it's, I don't know if it sounds silly to say it, but it just sounds like a bunch of scare tactics to me. And I mean, I've heard things like most of China, most of China is infected, and then they have all of these quarantines and travel bans and things like that. So that's basically what I hear.
Yesterday, I saw an article where a worker was home and he received a phone call not to come to work, and he was wondering why he was being terminated. And he was given no reason, but when he contacted his coworkers, he found out that he was fired for being Chinese. And they explained that, they said that customers were uncomfortable with his presence. Same old racist shit.
There was a lot of Twitter traffic about this medical worker in China who died, and they said that he had tried to alert China, the officials, of what was going on, and they were ignoring him. And he got the virus and died, apparently today or yesterday. Anyway, so what struck me is that like 2 days later they sequenced the genome and they built all these hospitals right away, and an amazing reaction, and it's just like this totally denying reality of what's going on.
Also out of this article, the thing that struck me was that when they did the task force, the bourgeois media here said, it can't be that serious because President Jinping is not the head of the task force. He's probably worried that it's not going to be able to accomplish anything, so he didn't want to be associated with it. But instead, it's the premier, and they go there. They're actually on site. They leave those details out. They leave out the details about the amount of money that is being allocated to be able to do this, and they definitely downplay the building of the hospitals. But the other big thing out of all this and all the media here is the racism and the increase of attacks on individuals as well as organizations and China itself.
The coronavirus reawakens old racist tropes against Chinese people. And that's the Washington Post from February 5th. My eyes are still pretty good. Racism shows ugly side as China fights coronavirus. I can't read that headline. Global Times, China, and there's no date, it's just the third one is China criticizes unfriendly US comments amid fight against novel coronavirus epidemic. That's English China, it's a military website. February 1st, 2020.
U.S. media focus on China. Authoritarian state, slow response, it's taken 3 weeks. Confusing, inept, ineffective. Ridicule of measures to boost morale and public education. Predictions of shortages, price spirals, mass chaos, long lines. Individual rights versus collective health. Detention without charges. That's what the U.S. media focuses on China.
Any of the stories, and the last few days, I think there's like 5 pages a day in the New York Times on the coronavirus. It's sort of incredible. And it's true in all the media. If you're just spiraling through a Google News feed, you'll see article after article, and they're each taking a different angle. But it's really saying, you know, that this is an authoritarian state, they've locked people down and they're going to be stuck without food and there's going to be mass chaos. I mean, this is really the prediction. And then they ridicule, actually, the thousands of health workers going to Wuhan saying, oh, isn't this ridiculous, why they're carrying red banners and, you know, they're confident and so on. So reading the news is really interesting if you're reading the US news, because then again, if you compare it to what they're reporting in China, they're both describing what they're doing, they're describing assistance that's coming, and how they're going to take care of it. So let's go over some of the things that they're covering.
Emergency health measures. Build 2 hospitals in 10 days, 1,000 beds, 1,600 beds. Latest equipment. The most advanced measures treat respiratory illnesses. Test kits distributed nationally. Mass distribution of masks and gloves. Massive fresh food deliveries to Wuhan. Enforce stable prices, freeze all payment obligations on loans, credit cards, and rent. Mass education on health measures. Thousands of doctors and medical teams sent to Wuhan. National focus on research into cures and prevention.
Full assistance and solidarity affirms China's battle against the coronavirus by Hu Yue, published on 2020, February 5th. Many foreigners have chosen to stay in China to join the battle against the novel coronavirus epidemic. Governments and leaders of foreign countries are also aiding China, showing firm friendship. Epidemic prevention and control supplies donated by 21 countries have arrived in China so far.
This is just one, I couldn't post the whole article here, but this is one article describing people actually traveling to China, volunteering en masse, coming from other parts of China and from other countries around the world in a real mass display of solidarity and to raise morale. And so that is some of the other coverage. I couldn't find any mention of this anywhere in the US press. And I went looking, I want to say. There are certain news stories I wanted to see. Gee, if they're highlighting this in China, did it get into any of the US press? No. Now, the one thing that has been in the US press a great deal is the quarantine. The quarantine. So let's discuss what the quarantine is and what it means. Because, you know, there's always the image from quarantines in the Middle Ages and what was called the Black Death, you know, from the, and it was unknown and it was terrifying to people. And so the idea of being stuck where there is disease is very scary, right? But how is it, what's happening in China in this area of Wuhan?
Partial quarantine, 35 million people, more than 10 largest US cities. Isolate those sick. Restrict public gatherings to lessen contagion. Close theaters, sports centers, shopping malls, schools, and non-urgent workplaces, including offices and factories. Restrict travel. Trains, public transport, air travel shut down. Cancel Chinese New Year celebrations. Testing and monitoring in all public places. Open hospitals, health centers, food shops, free taxis for essential trips.
So let's really, and I'm sure folks here have seen some things, both in the US press, let's discuss sort of what you've seen that's really hostile, and also what you've seen, is this good? Is this an infringement on personal rights or not? Is this a way of combating disease?
I wanted to comment that the way they're phrasing this as a really huge negative, it bothered me because it's the hypocritical nature, because just this morning I saw that in Japan, the authorities there quarantined an entire cruise ship with 3,700 people. And two cruise ships?
Yeah.
Okay, so 2 cruise ships, and as the, you know, on those ships, you're stuck in that room that's like the size of a closet, the way they have it on, you know, on a boat. That, I think, would make me lose all, like I would freak out being in that kind of a, but anyway, it's hard, and it's like, but they just report it as, oh wow, you know, vacation from hell. But then when it happens in China, it's like this authoritarian government is trapping people, and it just, there's no sense of proportion. I don't know. So that's irritating me.
What about what China is doing that shows how superior planning, a system that's built on planning for the needs of people is just more effective in a superior system that tells, you know. One of the shortages that occurred in China during this epidemic was the masks that people have to wear to, just little cloth masks, and they had a shortage. So they built a factory in 2 days. A factory just to make surgical masks. That's it.
How about closing theaters, sports centers, shopping malls, schools, all workplaces that aren't to do with urgent care? What do we think of that?
That's a positive move. Yes.
That's where it would spread.
That's where it spreads. That's where it spreads. Now, let's look back at this point. Freeze all payment obligations. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great? Do you think capitalists here would allow that to happen? Now, there are capitalists in China. We should know that. And they can be powerful. But the state and the Communist Party is frankly more powerful. And in a crisis, they're going to say, well, we're freezing the rent, the credit cards, everything. Now here, if you get the flu, what do they tell you to do?
Go to work. Stay home.
Really, they do tell you to go to work. And even all the ads are take Theraflu, and they show a teacher sneezing, and she takes this liquid, and she goes right back to teaching a room full of kids. I mean, we've all seen the ads. The message is, if you're sick, go to work. And no one would think that their rent could be frozen. How many landlords would be objecting to that.
Everyone.
What if every landlord, your rent is frozen for the next month? Would that be allowed?
No.
And so there's a reason why these emergency health things aren't covered at all. They simply say people are locked in their apartments. And so anyone in the capitalist world thinks, oh my God, what happened to my job? How am I going to pay my bills? This is, now, I think anyone who's locked in their apartment is probably bored to death. Everyone wants to get out, right? It's not a great measure. It's not a great measure. But if you have an unknown disease that's spreading very fast, and you're trying to get a hold of it, and they're trying to find immediate treatments and what treatments work the best, right? So they are taking a lot of emergency measures. There may be things that we don't know about this virus that is causing this level of concern as to how contagious it is, what the levels of mortality are, and so on. But it goes back to these earlier figures that China very well knows that diseases spread fast in a global world. Very, very fast. And if you don't take action very quickly, it will spread very fast. And we could look at the lesson of swine flu in the US, where no measures were taken. Or we could look at the measure of a flu just last year. It happened to be, they said, the most serious flu season in about 40 years. So it's not that every year there's 60 to 80,000 deaths. It's usually about 20 to 30,000 people in the US that die every year from flu. That's pretty high, right?
Yeah.
And it's actually, what was particularly dangerous about the swine flu was that hit young people. Almost no one over 60 got it because it seemed it was a mutation of an earlier, older people had a natural immunity. So flus hit different generations. The one in China, they feel hits older folks more than younger, men more than women. You know, they're studying all these things. It has a lot to do. And science can answer things. It can either spread fear, or if you get a lock on it very quickly, you have answers that can lead to the best treatment. Now, wanted to go on a few other things. I want to talk about the HIV/AIDS crisis in the US. Because we can't say, well, China did that and we're helpless here. You know, I think we have to think, even right here, if a flu, a pandemic, anything like that hits, what are the kind of tactics, what are the thoughts, what are the demands that we should raise? So that's an important part of it. But just before I go into that, just if a few people could describe what brakes does capitalism put on emergency health measures?
Well, the health system doesn't want to waste money, as they would put it, on people who are poor and from oppressed communities. And those are the ones who are the first in this country to lose out or lose their lives or be ill much longer. In addition, their health issues are they're more compromised from health diseases because of lack of food and housing and health care and all the necessities you need that you don't get automatically under capitalism. And that's a real factor here. I think the way that the US is playing it against China is deliberately to show this is a stupid, crazy country and they have no right to do these things. We wouldn't do that here. And basically, they wouldn't do it where they should do it when there's an epidemic of disease. And the flu has wiped out millions of lives over the decades of flu epidemics that have taken place. So what China has done is very remarkable. They've set up a very difficult situation for people that may not be able to move out of their own house or out of their own community because of the epidemic that is happening, but they're doing things to try to stop it from spreading to a much larger number of the population. And that's what the U.S. wouldn't give two hoots about, especially of poor people and people of color in this country.
Capitalism, since it is a profit-based system, in a crisis like this, it would just make this available to the rich instead of the poor people.
In this country, even for workers, you have to earn sick time by working, and and when you have used up what you have earned, you have no more. So workers will go to work sick. Even in a contract with a union like I have, when you run out of sick time, you can probably take some more time, but that's your vacation time, and so screw that vacation you were going to take this summer. And when you run out of those, your job is still threatened because you're not, you're less productive according to the boss. Of course, you're not because you're sick.
Other thing that happens, I think, under capitalism, certainly in relation to the HIV virus, is that under capitalism, the people who get sick are stigmatized, and groups are stigmatized without any rational reason for it. So, for instance, all gay people were stigmatized during the HIV epidemic. Haitians were stigmatized under the HIV epidemic. There was no reason or rationale for it, but they just picked those people. Now Chinese people are being stigmatized. And it makes no sense, but what it does is it stops people from really looking rationally at what the problems are.
In 2012, Workers' World Party's People with Disability Caucus held a forum on the anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act, and one of the speakers gave a talk comparing the response of the United States to Hurricane Katrina, the racist response, to the way Socialist Cuba rescues and responds and rescues the people in greatest need, people with disabilities and seniors first, and is organized to do that. This week, through my union, I went to a meeting of the New York chapter of the Hearing Loss Association of America, and they had two people from the New York City Agency for Emergency Preparedness, and they were explaining how the city supposedly was trying to provide emergency help in disasters, particularly for people with hearing disabilities. One person asked a question, well, how come people have to fill out this form? I don't need window guards, or some people are familiar with it, as the children don't fall out a window, but there is no form to register people with mobility disabilities that can't get out if there's a power failure and electrical failure, and they didn't have an answer for that. And also, they said that they still have not changed the 911 emergency system where a deaf person can text. They're supposed to do it in the summer. That's been delayed. They didn't explain why it was delayed. That's where capitalism puts profits before people. Thank you.
I want to describe where I'm going with this, because I think where this virus is going is either this one or another one will come to the U.S., right? Viruses and flus come every single year. And we need to think, as a people's movement, what are the demands that should be raised? What are the demands that people can be mobilized around right here? We can't say, oh, we don't have socialism here. There's nothing we can do. So it's an important question for us to look at, both what China is doing, but I want to look back at the lessons learned from the HIV/AIDS crisis, because that was a decade of some of the most incredible struggle. Now, HIV/AIDS, it really began in 1981, and by 1983, it was actually identified as the HIV virus. It was a very slow-moving virus that attacked the immune system gradually. It's not like a respiratory virus, so we're not making any comparison there. but we're talking about really the impact that it had. It was first recognized by the Center for Disease Control, as I say, in 1981, and its cause, the HIV infection, was identified about the same time. But it became not just an illness, it became a source of enormous discrimination, absolutely reactionary, racist discrimination against LGBTQ people and against Haitians. There was actually a ban, a bar on any Haitian people coming to the US during this time. There were all kinds of misconceptions about how it was spread, how contagious it was. People were denied treatment, even in hospitals. Now, and I'm sure there are folks here that have a lot more experiences. I just want to touch on this, and then we're going to pass the mic around again. But there was a coalition called the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and ACT UP, it was called, ACT UP. It was an international, you can still look it up today, grassroots political campaign. And they said they were going to focus on political action and also gathering information, medical research, treatment, advocacy, working to change legislation, and working on changes in public places. They began, though, with a mass action of mass civil disobedience in front of the US Supreme Court at the time of it was the second National March on Washington for LGBTQ rights. That didn't happen until 1987. So here's a disease that for 6 years had a hold and was covered daily in the press and creating a hysteria. And whole families would be blocked and excluded, and people couldn't get treatment. Now, it went from that action, hundreds of ACT UP members took over Wall Street and to demand greater access to experimental AIDS drugs, and also demanding a coordinated national policy. I mean, when you look back and see how many years it took just to say, let's have a national policy on this. And of course, by then it was spreading worldwide. There was another action that they shut down the New York Stock Exchange. That was in September of 1989. They held big action at the General Post Office on tax night to shut down the post office, and that was a famous silence equal death campaign. And there were signs everywhere saying that, silence equals death. And it was pushing people to speak out and to act. They had a takeover and a shutdown of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Again, drugs, care. The chant was, hey, hey, FDA, how many people have you killed today? They had a famous action at St. Patrick's Cathedral because Cardinal O'Connor was so reactionary on this issue and wanted to ban the use of condoms. And still, that's any sex education in New York City public schools. And along with the Catholic Church condemnation of homosexuality. So there was really a confrontation within the church. And they shut down the church. Very important. Then, finally, St. Vincent's, which was a Catholic center, medical center, was set up as an AIDS hospital 10 years later. Now, in China, it took 10 days, 10 days to set up a major hospital. To build a major hospital, you're right, to build a major hospital from scratch. 2 hospitals. But it took 10 years to have a hospital where people could go for hospice care, or for drugs, or for treatment of any kind, and be treated respectfully. And that took a struggle too. They actually had to take over parts of St. Vincent's and demand that the religious order that ran it change their attitudes on dealing with people with HIV. And they trained them. It took a confrontation. It took a confrontation. During Operation Desert Storm, the 1991 war against Iraq, they took over CBS Evening News with a message, and they got on national TV. They went right into the station. The chant was, "AIDS is news. Fight AIDS, not Arabs." That was quite a message. And they did the same thing at the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. There was a big action in Grand Central Station. I was thinking of that tonight as we were watching the Fuck the Police, NYPD, how do you spell racist, NYPD. Just this last week, there was a big action at Grand Central Station, big banners, money for AIDS, not for war. And signs saying 1 AIDS death every 8 minutes. That's what the toll was at that time. And all across the country this began. This is a movement that began in New York and on the West Coast, and then everywhere. Different very radical demands were raised, and actions at the Department of Health and Human Services by '91, demands for compassionate and a comprehensive national policy. It was a big deal when even a celebrity at the Oscars or something would speak out and say, we needed a policy toward AIDS. It was 10 years into the disease. The demand for treatment efforts, full-scale national education programs, research, that was the biggest demand. And then as new drugs came on, they were prohibitively expensive. So unless you were very wealthy, and it wasn't covered on insurance, that was another struggle against the insurance companies. Against the insurance companies, that these drugs should be covered. And so there were all kinds of actions and sit-ins and whatnot at the insurance companies to provide basic coverage. So all of these things, and as I say, I'm sure there are folks here that know more about this, and we could think about it with other diseases, but it does take a struggle. It takes a struggle, but we should never say, well, because we can't do what they're doing in China, we can't do anything. No, we got to be able to make real demands, clear demands, demands on the insurance companies, demands on the media, demands against the government as to why there isn't a policy, whether it's for flu, killing 80,000 people last year. Why shouldn't that have been a national program?
First thing I want to say is the ruling class was very slow to push for any real treatment for HIV disease. I worked at Cabrini Medical Center, which has since closed, but we had floors of patients that all had HIV or related problems. And they were there for months at a time. And many, many patients died in the hospital because there was no real treatment for the longest time. It was all based on treating the symptoms, but not actively treating the disease. And that was true, I'm sure, at St. Vincent's as well, which is the other Catholic hospital in that community that caught a lot of the patient population. And the stigma was terrible. And for the most part, most of the staff in these hospitals did not want to deal with the disease at all. And the care the patient got, most patients got, left a lot to be desired. I mean, at Cabrini, we did have a number of doctors who were sympathetic, largely men, gay men who were doctors who worked in the hospital. But beyond that, the nursing staff was so stigmatizing the patients who came in with HIV. And I'm sure I'm giving you an experience based on working in an emergency room where there were nurses who didn't want to touch these patients, didn't want to deal with them. And it's an example, and I'm sure that wasn't the only hospital that was true for, but it was a major, major issue in New York City. The number of people with HIV disease and those who really they got some care, but nowhere near the kind of care that would have made a qualitative difference for many of these patients. And really it was based on no real start to find an answer or drugs that would work. Today, there are lots of drugs out there that people who are HIV positive can take, and it's giving them a longer life because they can control the situation more today than they could then. In the 80s, between the stigma and the lack of concern of people taking care of patients with HIV disease, it was horrendous for the patients. I mean, there were some people who cared, but for the most part, it was a very stigmatized disease. And the response from healthcare workers left a great deal to be desired.
While Sara was performing a wonderful statistic showing the really a class struggle in the world in response to the people's health, I wanted to mention two very important points. One of them, I was thinking about Iran. I have to do that because I come from that part. We do have an anti-imperialist system, but we don't have a socialist system. And our country responded very friendly to Chinese people. And they said, we are ready to do anything you want. Russia also responded, Putin responded very nicely. China had, as Sara said, a lot of friends around the world who responded nicely, exactly opposite to reactionary position of the White House, saying that the virus is helping U.S. economy. So how could a person be a monster to say that the virus in the United States is helping our economy in United States, and whose economy? A big capitalist. And those who want to isolate China, they did that to such an extent that a lot of people are talking now it was a biological attack against China by United States. You see, they even writing about that and things because of this reactionary position. But come back to my situation in Iran, we do have this problem in Iran too. So I agree with Sara that we can't put our hand on each other and say, no, we can't do anything. We have to mobilize the people. One aspect which helped me during this coronavirus in an ideological struggle inside the working class in Iran was the question of China itself, because as we know, the question of China, is it a capitalist system, is it not a capitalist system, what happened, it gives a lot of opportunity to bring the left to the right position about China. That could never happen with this. When I see Sara talking in such a detail, I was hoping I can get a copy of this speech to take to our left friends and comrades who are confused about the situation of China. Because the competition in the final analysis between capitalists and socialists is to show who serves the people. It's not who has more weapon. You need weapon. But really, people of the world would look at China, how they fighting coronavirus, and how United States fighted HIV. So I don't think an opportunity like this happens a lot. So parties should seize that opportunity, and at the same time, I hope they can explain to the left and show the party position was right. Although China is using capitalists to develop the productive forces, but the party is there and there is socialist section. Without that socialist section and the leadership, you won't be able to do that.
I was thinking about when the comrades talking about how the nurses didn't want to touch the AIDS patients and all that kind of stuff. That's because in the capitalist system we are taught the policy of individualism. So, and right over here in America, it's about everybody's taught to do their own thing and to reject the next person, and to reject collectivism, and to reject joining together. While in the socialist system, they support collectivism. That's why in China they're able to step to that situation which is in Wuhan correctly, and you see within 10 days they had erected 2 hospitals, they had other demonstrations going on, and they had put forth the policy by which to combat the disease which is spreading over there. While over here in America, they couldn't do nothing like that because the decisiveness and indecisiveness and disunity of the capitalist system is so widespread. So over here in America, we don't never really, and not just in America, but anywhere in the world where capitalism is the dominant system, you have the spirit of individuality prevailing.
Walter made about individualism, because in any struggle or any crisis, this is what, the capitalists love to, focus in on, rather than what's going on with the masses, or what's going on below when the masses are in motion, like they were during the 1980s, around the AIDS crisis. I just want to say this too, before I get into another point. The AIDS crisis, and I don't think we can say this enough, it really impacted the movement big time, including our own party. We've lost a lot of wonderful comrades to the AIDS crisis. It is still painful to this day. Just to, it just sort of brought those memories back around the wonderful comrades we lost. And early on in terms of the crisis. But I do want to get back to the point that Walter made, because while all these wonderful demonstrations, important demonstrations were going on, demanding, making all these demands, for education, for affordable drugs, etc. Again, it just reminded me about 4 individuals that the ruling class really focused in on. I mean, it was good because it opened up the whole discussion about the crisis. That's Magic Johnson. What happened to Magic Johnson in '91? Because it showed, of course, the AIDS crisis greatly impacted the gay community, of course. I mean, along with Haitians and so forth. But when it happened to someone famous like Magic Johnson, it's like, gee, maybe we should know more about what's going on with this virus because of who he was. Rock Hudson, who died in '85. That sort of really opened up, I think, in terms of the whole issue of the impact on gay men in this country. Ryan White,
Right.
The young man who died in 1990 from I think it was a blood transfusion. Arthur Ashe, incredible tennis player. So anyway, it just really showed how the AIDS, HIV/AIDS crisis, it just transcended. It transcended, different sectors of our class. But it was really, again, it was the mass movement, ACT UP, and other organizations that really it made the biggest difference. That made the biggest difference in this crisis, because it was happening from below. It was happening from the masses, and so anyway, it's just, again, the issue of education is so important. And that's what this movement really emphasized, the need for education. And to show that, this is not a divide and conquer thing. We're all in this, together. We need to show solidarity with each other. we need that solidarity. And that's what's going on in China today too, that solidarity with those who are the most impacted, and putting those funds and putting those resources towards trying to deal with this crisis. So anyway, it's really good that we're sort of revisiting this important period.
One thing about the effect of that struggle, which was like, it was a burst in the whole movement, and we're still chanting, "Act up." You know, that's like still chant. That's a big chant on the street now that comes from that. But the question of the kind of political demands when there's a crisis like this, a health crisis like this, that the party took up years before ACT UP. Leslie Feinberg actually did a lot of research so that the party was putting out in the newspaper and also in popular on the street and literature that explained the science, that answered the all the anti, think of the word for it, but that answered it and came up with the demands of I forgot the words of it, but that what was needed was what they're doing in China now, and all out, get it, I forgot what the name of the project was, kind of the way they did the atom bomb, where they got, I think that's what it was.
Exactly.
What, the Manhattan Project. You know, I mean, but the kind of thing where you bring all the top scientists together. You bring all the research together and you fight this. And that's what we had, we didn't say banners for the Manhattan Project, but that was raised, that was the example. But we did have the banners that not only, they called for money for AIDS, not for war, in the Pride marches and in other demonstrations. But put out so to see, that's what we were demanding, and that's what China is doing.
People have talked about international solidarity and how other countries have supported China, and also particularly during the AIDS crisis of how difficult it was to get the drugs and how expensive they were. People may know that Cuba, despite all the deprivations and the blockade, has one of the most vibrant biotechnical industries, and they have developed many medicines, antivirals, etc. One of the most powerful that's in the world today was developed by Cuba, and it's being used in China to treat this coronavirus. And Cuba has offered the technology to the Chinese government, and a joint China-Cuba team has converted a biochemical warehouse or laboratory into a laboratory to mass produce this particular antiviral, which I think the World Health Organization says is one of the best in treating these respiratory viruses. And on January 25th, that's how quickly they were able to get it operating. January 25th was, 2 weeks after they discovered this virus. Cuba has helping China, the Cuban and Chinese scientists are mass producing this antiviral, which is being distributed no cost. I mean, the Chinese government is paying for the research and the development and the production. The Cubans are not taking anything from it. In addition, Cubans have sent a medical team to China, and they've set up a command center at the Cuban embassy. And one of the things they're doing is they're following every Cuban national that's in China. They have the name and are in contact with everyone. None of them have been infected so far, but they're following, each one. There are students studying there. There are diplomats and workers, scientists, and other medical professionals. And Cuba has been able to follow everyone. And that's part of their health system in Cuba, is that they know where everybody is and what their condition is. They have the doctors visit everybody. And you know, it's part of the reason to support a quarantine when there's an epidemic like this, is that it enables the government and the medical teams to follow everybody, to know where everybody is and know the condition of everybody. And the Cubans are also offering, you know, their medical support. They may be sending more doctors, you know, into China, you know, if they can. Of course, you would never read anything about this in the U.S. media. In fact, in the U.S. media, all the articles about Cuban doctors lately have been that the Cubans are trafficking in doctors. They're calling them slaves. They're not being paid enough. They have party officials standing over their shoulders so they can't defect. I mean, just nonsense. When you tell the Cubans that, they laugh. You know, most of the Cuban doctors overseas are volunteers. You know, they're not being forced to do it. And finally, in international solidarity, the Cuban government and the party has put out a statement in support of what they call their Chinese brothers and sisters, offering support, offering concern, and whatever they can do, and saying, we support you, we're concerned about it, and despite what other people are saying, criticizing you, you know, we have confidence in your ability to deal with the situation. And that's what true international solidarity is.
In addition to what Bill just said, I've read of at least 2 other treatments that's been used. I think Russia provided a vaccine, and China has developed one in the university there. I don't know what's more effective. The Chinese one is just 2 days old. I think it was yesterday that this happened. I haven't read anything else about it. So there's at least 3 treatments right now that I'm aware of. I didn't know about that Cuba's antiviral was being used in China. So that's 3 at least. One of the things that I'm worried, I'm hoping that this doesn't come true, but this is what I'm thinking. You know, with the indiscipline of the imperialists, and they're grabbing any propaganda material they can. They broke Chinese quarantine to remove their populations from Wuhan, and they had no plan with what to do with these people they're removing, because there's no regime for dealing with crises like this in the West. So Germany, the United States, and Japan, I think, removed their nationals and broke Chinese quarantine to do it. So I'm worried that, you know, with China's approach, they'll probably get a handle on this disease. But I don't think this thing is going to stop spreading around the world in these other countries who aren't taking care of shit, you know. So that's my worry. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it doesn't spread very far, but because the numbers are still small outside of China. But you know, small can get big real fast with a virus. Sorry.
The U.S. has done 2 things, along with their racist coverage and all their attacks. And their worry about what this will do for the stock market and oil prices and all kind. I mean, it's really horrendous, the news articles that you see. They're so self-serving, how they're going to make money or lose money on this. But they have barred anyone from China who's Chinese coming into the U.S. They did bring back 5,000 U.S. nationals to the U.S. and asked them to self-quarantine. They quarantined a handful who were running fevers. And the reason they said they couldn't quarantine the 5,000 people they brought back and were just making it a matter of trust that they would self-quarantine was they said, why, to quarantine 5,000 people with just, this was the head of Homeland Security speaking. I mean, they got a lot of resources in Homeland Security, right? So to quarantine 5,000 people would just blow the doors off the budget. So, you know, 35 million people, we're going to stop a disease, but 5,000 people, that would just blow the doors off. See, so these are real questions, because it does show that science, cooperating and collaborating, that's the other thing, and that is that the pharmaceutical companies in this country want to own a drug, and they don't want it commonly shared. And they don't want the sequencing, even of a disease, known by everyone. That frustrated them, that China immediately made this known worldwide within the first 2 days of and encouraged everyone to start doing research on it. So, in every crisis, and this is true whether it's a medical crisis, whether it is a tornado, a flood, a fire, whether it's Trump, whether it's a war, every crisis, the response has got to be to not get demoralized, but to think, what are the demands? What is it that people need right now? What is it that the government should provide and is not? And also, how do you concretely build solidarity? How do you break down fear? And those are some of the lessons that the whole world is learning in this example in China, because they're showing medically how they're fighting it. They're showing economically how they're fighting it. But they're also, all of the coverage is the solidarity of people coming to help. And that is such a lesson. So I'm going to encourage you to look at some of the Chinese news services. Let me end on that point, because I think we want to study this. We're scientists here. Marxists are scientists. And we got to always be studying world movements, new developments, what the class struggle on the other side of the world is teaching here. And they're also looking to what demands we make here.